G'day and welcome to another episode of Perth Property Insider. I'm your host, Jared Mann, and today I'm thrilled to have Michael Yardney back on the podcast. He's one of Australia's top 50 influential thought leaders. He's once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor, picked that award up many times, and he's a property expert, and he's also a leading expert on psychology of success and wealth creation. So we're going to get stuck into what you need to know to master the property cycle. We're going to be going into the factors that influence the property cycle. How do we know where the property cycle is now? Some really key stuff we're going to cover in there. And the lessons we've learned along the way to know where we are and what sort of action we should be looking to take. Then we finish out by covering off what's ahead and what the market is going to do next. So it's going to be a great one. Let's go inside.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management specialists servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here is your host, Jared Mann.
G'day, Michael. Welcome back to Perth Property Insider. I really appreciate having you on again.
My pleasure, Jared.
So, 12 months of booming real estate markets around Australia. Hasn't it been an interesting year?
Well, I don't think anyone would have predicted that we would have had such a great year with 20+% growth in most properties and up to 30% growth in certain selected locations around Australia.
I guess it begs the question, where are we at in the property cycle? Because I'm already starting to see plenty of mixed media, shall we say, out there.
Sure. Well, there's no doubt that we've passed the peak of the growth of this property cycle. And the peak was around March this year. And over the last couple of months, capital growth has slowed down for a number of reasons, including affordability, including some concerns about rising interest rates, and including APRA sort of tapping its foot on the brake pedal to slow things down a bit. But people are asking now the same question as you, Jared. Is it too late? Is this the end of the cycle or what's ahead?
So what would you say to the some of the commentators that think that property is going to crash in 2022? Is there any basis for that you can see?
Okay, so what could cause a property market to crash? Now, that's a different question to the first one, and I think it would be useful to talk about what's happening to the cycle. And so to actually give a spoiler up front, no, the property market is not going to crash. Let's talk about the cycle in general, and then we can actually talk about next year in specific. Would that be a good way of doing it?
Yeah, that's great. And I guess
people seem to ask me, well, how long do cycles last? You read about the 7-year property cycle, the 18-year property cycle, and the answer is there isn't a set time. So you can't say things are going to happen in 2022 or 2023 because of a period of time. Now, interestingly, I've invested since the early 1970s. So I've invested through multiple cycles, and we had a peak. So a cycle is from one peak to the next. 2003 was a peak around Australia. Now, we're talking about Australia, Jared, rather than the Perth property cycle or the Melbourne cycle, because each state works at a different cycle, and we know Perth totally worked at a different cycle to Australia. But if we go back to the big picture, there was a peak in 2003, there was a peak in 2007, 2010, and the last peak was 2017. And that was the peak of the property cycle on the east coast of Australia.
Yes. And Brisbane and Perth, we missed out on that one, didn't we?
Yes, you did. And that's why I'm saying each state's at a different stage. So while you had some really strong growth, yes, Western Australia and Perth in particular missed out that last one. So it shows that despite us having the same federal government, the same tax rates, the same interest rate, local factors affect the property cycle. So I guess there's a good lesson to learn from that. So after the peak, generally we go into a slump, a slowdown where property values go down for a little while, and some properties hold their value better than others, depending upon how fast it's gone up and how high property values have gone. The slump period lasts often for a number of years. And then eventually buyers come back into the market, the excess stock's taken up, the government lowers interest rates to make the economy improve and increase the property market. And then there's a period of stabilisation, and then there's a slow upturn, and then there's the boom phase. But what's happened this time, again, particularly on the East Coast, Perth has definitely had a rise this year, but not to the same extent as other states. What's happened is we've actually gone from the difficult times, partly because of COVID, partly because of the federal election in 2019 worrying people, partly because of APRA slowing things down. So from 2017, a few stops and starts, and then in October 2020, I called the bottom of the cycle, and I was right for once. And so we've gone straight into the boom stage. So I see this particular cycle, Jared, being shorter. We've sort of missed out a little bit, and shorter, faster, quicker, and it's unsustainable at the levels of growth that we've had in many parts of Australia.
So we're probably not going to see that 3.5 year, sticking to the rule of 3.5 years up and 3.5 years down or sideways this time.
Unlikely, Jared. I think you're right. The cycles are driven by a whole lot of socioeconomic factors.
Yeah.
Big one, though, is the flow of credit, the availability of credit, but it's also a lot to do with consumer confidence. I mean, there are other factors
and I think the confidence side especially is why Sydney, Melbourne, and to a lesser extent Brisbane has really surged, where Perth has languished a bit. Just anecdotally speaking to everyone, speaking to business owners, speaking to clients, over here in Perth, we're coming off of very difficult times. There's a skepticism in the air. The confidence is really only just starting to get back, and then we look ahead and we see some headwinds. So that is a massive factor. What are some
very much so? Consumer confidence is fickle, and the longer you've had a difficult time, the longer it stays in your memory, the harder it is to break out and start developing confidence. Because every time people in Western Australia have, and you think, hey, this is the end, it's all going to pick up, something comes and knocks you again, doesn't it? Whether it's coronavirus or then the Delta strain or now the latest strain, or when we all of a sudden iron ores, okay, now China's fighting against us. And so the more difficult times you've had, the harder it is to get that consumer confidence, isn't it?
Yeah. What are some of the other factors that go into influencing that property cycle? Because it's good to have them on our radar.
Of course. Well, interest rates, as I started to say, are important. So when interest rates fall and funds are readily available, that's a major driver in property demand. When money's cheaper, you feel more comfortable, you can spend more, you can borrow more. The alternative, the opposite, isn't exactly right. So people are saying interest rates are now going to go up, and because if interest rates go up, house prices are going to fall. Well, there's been studies done over the last few interest rate rises, and in fact, property values didn't drop straight away again. It doesn't work exactly in reverse. But it's not just interest rates, it's also the availability of money. And so that's where APRA is making it harder. Even more recently, they've talked about not just the 3% buffer, but now about giving different interest rates to home buyers compared to investors, because they perceive investors are more risky, different interest rates to people who've got bigger deposits than others. So it's the availability of money that makes a difference.
Potentially imposing a borrowing cap, and there's talk of that, and that could limit, I guess, the total borrowings that an investor or homeowner can take.
Yes. So interest rates and money is a big factor. The economy is another big factor in what drives property cycles. Confidence, as we said, but also business confidence, employment prospects, jobs growth, wages growth. If you feel confident in your finances, in your financial position, Jared, you're more likely to buy a house. Now, we think a lot like investors, but remember, 70% of properties are bought by owner-occupiers, and they won't make a big decision if they're not sure about their financial security. So, again, with the economy in Western Australia languishing and not doing as well as other parts of Australia, that's one of the reasons people didn't take that big step, even though the interest rates were as cheap for you as they are for me. Supply and demand is the other big one, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, at the times during booms, people overbuild. All those high-rise towers that turned up in Western Australia, not only there, of course, not only in Perth, but in other parts of Australia too. And all of a sudden, who's going to fill them all?
Yeah. And I think all the capitals seem to have had a problem with the CBD apartments, especially when coronavirus impacted that demographic of buyer and renter the most, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, that's another good point, demographics, because in particular, household formation. So we talk a lot about population growth and the fact that more people need more houses, but it's actually not as much more people, because if you have a baby, you've got to increase your family by 50%, so to speak, or a third, I guess, but that doesn't mean you need another house. So it's really how many households are formed. And what's helped us through the last couple of years, Jared, when we haven't had immigration coming to Australia, is the household formation from the millennials, and many of them moving from apartments into household formation age now, and partly with regard to the changes with COVID and wanting Zoom rooms and different sorts of accommodation. That's underpinned our property markets around Australia. So demographics is one of the other big factors driving property cycles.
Yeah, good one. So that all makes a lot of sense. So how do we actually start to know where we are in the property cycle?
Well, I think the first lesson is to remember that there is a property cycle. So for a lot of more beginning investors, they won't know the difference.
Yeah.
And in Western Australia in particular, the market has been flat for a long time. So where's the cycle? The main cycle, of course, happens because we're human. We tend to share the same optimism or pessimism. And as I said, it's not because of a period of time. It really is to do with when we hear the news is good and when we see property values going up, and that's happened particularly on the east coast of Australia this year, and you read that your house is worth so much more, the wealth effect kicks in and you overspend, you buy more, you upgrade your home, you invest. And so the market tends to overshoot. But then when the next stage of the cycle happens and you hear all the bad news, it sort of undershoots as well. So the first lesson, I guess, from the past is, there are cycles. The next one to help understand is that what the market usually thinks, where we are in the cycle, what the commentators think is usually wrong. It's so hard to tell in the middle of it. Boy, is it easy to look back and say, clearly the market bottomed then, or clearly the market topped then. But we've been both around long enough to know the rear view mirror is easier to look through than the
2020 vision in hindsight.
Isn't it? Yeah. I think the other big lesson, of course, is there isn't one property market. So they generalise. The media talks about the Australian property market. But even in Western Australia, even in Perth, there isn't one Perth market. There's the house and land market. There's the new home buyer market. There's the established market. There's the apartment market. And there's the high end, which works at a totally different cycle to the more average and lower suburbs as well. And maybe one last factor I think it's important to remember, I learned about it many years ago, is the concept of an X factor. And I'm not talking about the TV show, that music show. I'm talking about the fact that every year something comes out of the blue, unforeseen, that blows the best forecasts out of the water. Some people call it a black swan event. Now, I'm not talking about coronavirus. That's that one in a decade where the world breaks. And every decade or so, the world does break. Something goes wrong. The global financial crisis, 9/11, coronavirus. But there are smaller things like the election that no one thought the government
with the negative
would
gearing
win.
proposals on the table. That upset us.
Yeah,
and
sure.
We had there's lots of them going back, isn't there?
In fact, I learned about this from an economist, Don Stammer, who used to write what was the BRW that then was taken over by the Financial Review. And every year he tried to predict the X factor for the forthcoming year. And it was a fun little competition. One would have to see what is it. But by definition, it's unforeseen. You don't know what it is. You can't predict it, because if you would, it wouldn't be an X factor. So I think the big X factor for last year, 2020, was the coronavirus. And if you think about it, this time last year, we thought we were over it. We thought it was all okay. So the X factor for 2021 is the Delta strain of the coronavirus. What's going to be for 2022? Is it going to be this new Omicron one or not? I don't
Look, there's always fears on the horizon. And that's something I've learned as an investor over the many cycles. And some people can spot every one of them and find many reasons not to act, regardless of where we're at too. So it's hard to find the balance between knowing what to be cautious of and, fear-mongering and getting stuck in analysis paralysis. Do you have any insights as to how to separate what's important?
Okay, that's a good point, Jared, because there will always be reasons not to invest. And so I think successful investors actually have a multi-decade approach, while the average investor thinks about the 5-year time horizon, and to be blunt, the average Australian thinks about what they're going to do this weekend. So
and look, then many others are just purely speculating and trying to time the market perfectly, compromising location and other, parts of asset selection to try to get in and get out at the right time. So
too hard with property, where the costs of buying and selling are so much. Don't even try and time the market. And in fact, the right time to buy is when your finances are right and when you can afford to do things, and then hold the best asset you can in the long term. So to answer your question also about how to avoid this fear, be careful who you listen to. It's not just the media, because the media is not there to educate you. It's there to entertain you. So they love negative headlines, but there's always going to be property pessimists out there. And look, let's not name them, but they're there in the media the whole time saying 20% fall, 30% fall. Only a year ago, this year they're saying a 10% fall next year. But look at their track record and you'll see that in general, they've been wrong. Now, of course, currently, there are a whole lot of people predicting what's going to happen in 2022. And there's one that's got a lot of publicity this last week. And what they've done is come up with 4 different scenarios. And one of them is going to be right, so they're going to be right. It's like me going to the track and betting on every horse, and my horse is going to win.
Yes.
And
you
so
probably
therefore,
saw
I'm a fantastic punter.
And all of the Perth-based media, because we're so, glass half empty as well, or maybe it's all media across Australia. I'm not sure. That's what gets the headlines and gets the views and clicks. But they ran with the most negative scenario. Property's going to, fall X percent, and we're all going to be underwater.
So I think what you've got to look at is the long-term trends rather than the short-term. And over the long term, property values have increased, and in the short term, they have their ups and downs. Now, in Western Australia, it has been for a long time because you had that significant boom that where property values, to be blunt, were overpriced. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
We were higher than when people Sydney in one stage, Michael. Do you remember?
Yes, I remember that. Well, look, I also remember people going up to the mines and getting jobs there and getting paid so much just for doing simple things. And so they had lots of money. It was, I believe, a once-in-a-lifetime boom that's not going to be experienced again. But it's a pity that some people have had to pay the price for that exuberance for a decade.
So what do you think is going to happen next? And should we really be paying too much attention, or should we be focusing on other things?
Well, I think it's important to pay attention to your money and your finances. And so what's going to happen next? I believe 2022 is still going to be a strong year for property values, but not as much growth. And the answer is that the lower growth's related to partly the pent-up demand's worked its way through. The lower interest rates, where people can afford a lot more, have sort of worked their way through. And we've got to realise the interest rates are low because the Reserve Bank is stimulating the economy to make inflation go up and try and boost the wages, try and boost employment. Recently, the government said they're going to bring 200,000 people in short-term, in a short period of time, not the normal migration, but visa holders, skilled workers.
Skilled labour, wasn't it?
That's right. And what that's going to mean is that the shortage of jobs will be taken up pretty quickly. And so therefore there's unlikely to be rising wages, which is one of the 2 factors the Reserve Bank needs to raise interest rates. So all the predictions from the bank economists and the naysayers are predicated on the fact that interest rates will go up, and if
That's
they
the
do,
one factor.
and when they will, then property values will drop. So that's the only reason they're saying property values are going to drop, because some people are going to get into mortgage stress, some people are going to be overcommitted. I can't see interest rate rises happening until wages go up, because at the moment wages have gone up about the rate of inflation. So it's actually not even real growth. And that means that if house prices have gone up 20%, 30%, but your wages haven't gone up much, eventually people can't afford to pay more. And that's going to slow the market down to a degree. So I can see that the Reserve Bank doesn't want to tank the property market. It doesn't want to. It wants that about as much as it wants another strain of coronavirus, Jared. APRA doesn't want to tank the property market. It just wants to slow its exuberance down. It went overboard last time. Hopefully the regulators have learned lessons from that. And if that's the case, then we're going to have a slowing, but not a significant drop. And then in 2023, there are so many factors that are going to happen between now and then. Yeah. I don't even want to make a prediction.
Yeah, that's good. So I guess it probably all comes back to the importance of asset selection then. If you've got your financial house in order and you are looking to park your money in the best asset that you can afford, then asset selection now more than ever would be critical, wouldn't it?
Of reasons. First of all, properties are as cheap to hold on to today as they ever have been. With interest rates as low, negative gearing isn't a factor for a lot of people because rents are almost covering the yields anyway. And so on that basis, I believe that some properties are going to increase in value more strongly than others moving forward, but they always have. But I see more of a two-tier property market moving forward in general, Jared, than before. See, as I said, property values are going to go up 25, 30%, not as much in Perth, but they've still done okay in Perth, and wages haven't gone up. And so the average Australian worker hasn't got more in their pay packet to pay more. On the other hand, the knowledge workers, the higher income earners, they have got more. They've got multiple streams of income. Business people have got shares and dividends and business income and property income. So the rich are going to get richer. That's a concern, and that's a different social argument to discuss at a different time. But they're going to still want to live near the Perth River, near the beaches, near the CBD, in the lifestyle areas. The rich aren't going to buy secondary properties. And so, therefore, I believe that in Western Australia, as around the rest of Australia, as we move through this cycle, some properties are going to keep increasing. And in the next year or two, affordability is going to stop other people. As for property investors, don't get stuck at the end of this cycle with the wrong sort of property. You need an A-grade asset, like you said, Jared.
And I do like Warren Buffett's quote, and paraphrasing here, but when the tide goes out, we see who's swimming naked.
Very much so.
That's really stuck with me.
The other quote of his I like, Jared, is wealth is the transfer of money from the impatient to the patient.
Great place to end things on, Michael. And thank you for taking us inside the property cycles and helping us, separate the crazy media headlines from what is likely to be ahead. So thank you.
My pleasure. Look forward to catching up with you again soon, and we'll see if I was right or not.
Exactly. Thanks, Michael.